Welcome to Prevention Through Connection. I'm Kathy Samuels, Project Director for the Manhasset Community Coalition Against Substance Abuse, also known as CASA. Today's program focuses on understanding the current culture and issues surrounding marijuana. This special edition of Prevention Through Connection features Kevin A. Sabet, Ph.D., author, consultant, assistant professor, and past advisor on drug policy for the Clinton, Bush, and Obama presidential administrations. Dr. Sabet has studied, researched, written about, implemented drug policy for almost 20 years. Dr. Sabet is also the director of the Drug Policy Institute at the University of Florida and an assistant professor in the College of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry. With Patrick J. Kennedy, he co-founded Project SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana. Dr. Sabet has appeared in hundreds of forums and discussions regarding his book, Reefer Sanity, 7 Great Myths About Marijuana, and has been featured on the front page of the New York Times and in virtually every major media publication and news channel on the subject of drug policy. Welcome to Prevention Through Connection.
Thanks so much for coming on your busy weeknight and having me here. I want to thank the library for hosting us and CASA for having me. Most of what I talk about is actually based on my book, and I won't put the librarian here on the spot to see if the book's in the library, but it's based on a book I wrote 2 years ago when I left the Obama administration called Reefer Sanity, 7 Great Myths About Marijuana. And I wrote the book really almost out of some sense of frustration because having traveled the country as part of the White House on this, really could sense the amount of misperceptions that were out there about marijuana, outdated perceptions about a war on drugs and about, sort of the culture wars of the 1960s and 70s and, parents not understanding or knowing how to talk to their kids about marijuana, many of whom tried marijuana themselves and didn't really know how then they could speak about it. There's a lot of confusion. And amidst all of this confusion, and really the central thesis of what I'm going to talk about tonight and what I talk about in my book, amidst all this confusion, a rapidly rising new industry that essentially will seek and does seek to create more heavy users in order to profit. And sort of we used to think about an industry like the cartels, which obviously it's an underground industry, or maybe the tobacco industry or the alcohol industry. We think about the pharmaceutical industry, obviously, when we look at how some reckless pharmaceutical companies marketed pain medication a decade ago. But we don't think often about the marijuana industry. It's not something, marijuana was always a counterculture drug, not a mainstream drug. It was, Berkeley. It wasn't Wall Street. And now what I would argue and what I'm seeing, and this gets reinforced when I travel around and speak, is that this really is coming from Wall Street. This really is coming from folks who, plain and simple, they want to be the next big tobacco. And what I'm worried about is that we're going to have to learn like we did from big tobacco. It's going to have to take another 100 years to kind of come to our senses and say, you know what, maybe we don't want another substance, even if it's not as harmful as heroin or as some of the pills that are out there. Maybe we don't want another industry, no matter what drug it is. In this case, it happens to be marijuana, that is downplaying the effects of a particular drug and essentially trying to profit off of addiction. So that's really my main concern. And I say in the beginning, I'm not talking about the 50 or 60-year-old person who's using a joint once a month and saying that person should go to jail. That's not my thesis. I'm not making moral judgments on people who use drugs, or certainly not against those who are in recovery and getting their life together. But what I do want to talk about is the science and what the evidence is saying in 2016. And again, I think a lot of our perceptions about marijuana are from outdated science and outdated rhetoric, and I don't think the truth is really getting out there. So first thing, I think there's a false dichotomy out there that says, well, there's 2 ways to deal with a drug like marijuana. We can either throw people in jail, have a war on drugs, or we can legalize it and treat it like alcohol or like tobacco. And first of all, I think that's a false dichotomy. I think there are many other ways that we could deal with drugs that don't involve people with an illness, putting them in prison, but also don't involve glorifying and normalizing and commercializing a habit-forming and absolutely addictive drug. It wasn't today's school presentation, which is good, but at a recent presentation, I had someone 16-year-old say to me, Kevin, you keep saying addictive, and we all know marijuana is not addictive. And I said, well, how do you know that? And the response was, well, I know it's not addictive because I use it every day. And then I had the other kids saying, well, it also makes me a better driver. We all know that. Everyone knows it makes you a better driver. And I said, really? Why do you think it makes you a better driver? And the response was, well, because I go 35 miles an hour in a 65 mile per hour zone when I'm stoned. So I'm better. Of course, that's not a better driver, right? That's equivalent to probably going 85 in a 65. And so, we sort of have humor. But the point is, there are a lot of misperceptions that are out there surrounding this. So again, my concern is this idea that we're going to create what I would call big marijuana, a massive industry that really relies on addiction for profit. Let's talk a little bit about kind of today's scene in marijuana. We now, as Americans, spend more money on marijuana today than we ever have really in modern times, and certainly more than we do on a drug like cocaine. If you remember in the late 80s and 90s, it was cocaine that we were so concerned about, rightfully so, a lot of people using. Americans spent about $30 billion on cocaine in 1990 and about $15 billion in 2013. That's totally flipped and changed in a very big way. Now we spend almost $40 billion on marijuana and about $10 billion on cocaine. We've reduced our cocaine consumption dramatically since the late 80s and early 90s, but we've increased consumption in other drugs like marijuana. The percentage of those who use marijuana daily is now almost 3%. And so that is more than was people who were using in the late 1970s, which really, many of you probably, no one in this audience was around in the 70s. I know that but in case you were, you might remember that, the 70s was the last time there was a lot of marijuana use in this country. We're now exceeding that. And the scary thing is, I think in my mind, is that the marijuana of today is not the marijuana of the 1970s, mainly because we've just become better at agriculture. I mean, we're better farmers. We know how to make stronger pot than we ever did. And, in the 1970s, if you wanted strong marijuana, you wanted to buy Mexican marijuana, right? That was what was called sin semilla, meaning without seeds. Because the marijuana grown in the U.S. in the 60s and 70s, you were smoking a weird conundrum of twigs and leaves and seeds, and there was some leaf in there too and some herbal material, but really it was not the best stuff. That has totally changed now, right? We don't get our good marijuana from Mexican cartels. That's not happening. It's from American grown and made marijuana, and that's because we have learned to really change the amount of THC. And I'm going to talk more in detail about that THC change. More recently, as the Journal of the American Medical Association Psychiatry has shown us in a couple of months ago, marijuana use and addiction has skyrocketed since the early 2000s. So there's been a big change in, like I was saying, in use in this country. And marijuana addiction for many people, it's real. I mean, it's not some mythical thing, and it's not something that you can only get addicted to heroin or only addicted to alcohol. For a good number of people, marijuana is addictive. And so why should we care about it in the first place? The 7 myths kind of go through. I'm not going to go through all the 7 myths tonight because of time, and I do want to leave time for questions. But I do want to cover some of the more popular myths. The first one being this one, that marijuana is harmless and non-addictive. And so to talk about that, let's actually look at the brain. Let's look at what the brain looks like really from age, from your birth to age 20. And as I was telling the kids today, your brain is essentially under construction really until about age 30. Meaning that the different parts of your brain, which are responsible for everything you do, so from the decisions that you make to your movement to everything, those are rapidly in development, right, until you're about age 30. And that matters a lot because, you make all kinds of decisions when you're young that could stick with you, your whole life. And that can be good and that can be bad. I mean, on the good side, if you're into sports, if you want to be good at sports, you don't start, you could start learning a sport after age 30 or 35, but you wouldn't be as good unless you started earlier. That's because your brain is more malleable when it's younger. It can pick things up better, which is great. The bad news is when you get things like childhood trauma in the mix, or child abuse, or you're exposed to violence when you're young, or you're exposed to drugs, or when I say drugs, obviously I mean alcohol as well. When that happens, the chances of that drug staying with you your whole life and becoming, you becoming addicted to it goes up. And so we know that marijuana is responsible for sort of affecting brain development in multiple parts of the brain. Parts that are responsible for coordination, vision, sensation, movement, judgment, reward, memory, all kinds of things. And what happens is when you ingest THC, the THC is that's what gets you high. So remember, marijuana is a plant, we'll just back up in a second, a plant of hundreds of components. It's a very complex plant. And what gets you high is actually the THC. And why that is because in your brain there are these receptors. You have opiate receptors as well for opiates. You have all kinds of receptors. You have essentially what we call cannabinoid receptors that are there. And when you ingest THC, the THC binds to those receptors in the brain that have to do with all these kinds of different parts of the brain. Now, this is very different than a drug like tobacco or like nicotine, right? And what I mean by that is, we've never heard of a tobacco-related car accident, right? You've never heard of tobacco-related, like a movement, from being too high on tobacco, you falling, or some coordination issue. Well, that's because tobacco actually doesn't affect those parts of the brain. It affects the lungs certainly, and it does affect reward and memory, but it doesn't affect those other parts that marijuana does affect. And what we know actually is that if you start using marijuana when you're 16, the chances of addiction are about 1 in 6. If you start later in life, the chances are about 1 in 11. And again, that's because the adolescent brain is so much more susceptible to marijuana than the adult brain. Now this is the, and I would show you the laser, but this is the graph that I was talking to you about marijuana becoming much stronger than it was in the 1960s. THC being the active ingredient, marijuana has been genetically bred, essentially, to get you more high than the marijuana from before. And that has big implications for addiction, for brain issues, other issues. Even as recently as 10 years ago, the marijuana of today versus 10 years ago, or certainly versus 20, 30, 40 years ago, is far less potent. And I'll talk, I don't know if many of you have heard about CBD, I'll talk about that later, but THC is what gets you high. And like I said, there are hundreds of other components in marijuana that we're only beginning to learn about, but the THC is what gets you high. So the average THC level in a joint today is about 11 to 12%. That is much more than in the 60s, which was hovering around 2%, and much more than certainly, like I said, even 10 years ago. But I'll tell you something, I wish I could say that marijuana's THC content stopped at 12%. I don't know how many of you have heard of dabbing or waxes, butane hash oil, anybody here? Not really. We're now talking about, folks, marijuana that is potent up to 98%. So think about 12% being that's a big high. I mean, 12% is nothing to scoff at. Now we're talking about 98%. What do I mean by that? Well, we have learned by using some butane and some PVC pipe, essentially, to be able to extract the THC from the marijuana. So you don't have all the other ingredients I talked about in the plant. They say, well, the cannabis plant was used thousands of years ago in different That's the entire plant. We're now talking just the THC that gets you high. We have learned to extract it. It comes, this waxy, oily substance comes out as a result. And now you have, and I know you have it in New York, and we have it obviously in Colorado and across the country, the ability to have a derivative that's up to 98, 99%, almost 100% pure THC. We have no clue what that is doing to the adolescent or adult brain, because the studies that have been done on marijuana today are studies with 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe 9% THC. We are only, if you can find a researcher doing a study with 15% THC, which there are a few, that's a pretty big deal. 98% THC just really isn't happening. And yet, this is happening around the country. And it's something that most parents are totally unaware of when we talk about dabbing or anything like that. It has nothing to do with the plant of marijuana, other than that this is the active ingredient that's been extracted from it. So really, I kind of call it the new frontier of marijuana, dabbing.
Can I just ask you a question? What were all those other things? Wax and
Oh, yeah, so this is
wax and what is that?
this is all different versions of the butane hash oil, of the dabbing, right? Dabbing is the verb. That's what right? We're going to dab this. So these are all different, like shatter, butter, hash oil caplets, green crack, it's called in some places where you can buy it recreationally or medically. Earwax, butane hash oil, they're all the different names for it. But they're all the same thing. These are, and there are hundreds of other things like this. Is just 6 of them. Yeah, so this is what it looks like. And so when we talk about emergency room admissions, people are like, emergency room admissions? Who ever goes to the emergency room for pot? Like, how is that even possible? Well, given the edibles, which I'll talk about edibles later, and given these dabs and all the other things, going to the emergency room is a reality now for marijuana. And it really was far less common, again, even you look at 2004, than it was in the last couple of years that we actually have data. And today there was a front page article in the Denver Post, and it was online, many of the blogs, about how Colorado, and I'll talk about Colorado data later, but how Colorado has seen a spike in emergency room admissions for marijuana since they've legalized, especially among tourists who go there thinking like, hey, I'm going to go relive the 60s and the fun times in the dorms. We're going to go to Colorado. And they're being exposed, and I'm talking baby boomers, are being exposed to a totally different drug. I mean, it's not the weed that they maybe, may remember. And so you now have more people going to the emergency room than you have ever before, almost as many as you do going for heroin. Now, of course, many more people use marijuana than heroin. That's a caveat we have to remember. But there are many, many more people going to the emergency room for marijuana than we have. I thought it would be also really important to talk about the fact that especially in an environment like this, and I know the school I visited today, I mean, people, which is great, I mean, it looks like a competitive scholastic environment. Everyone's wanting to go to the best colleges, everyone's wanting to get the best jobs, which is obviously great. But I do think it's important that people realize and understand that, again, today's marijuana is having an effect on things that we care about, like learning and school aptitude and school achievement. So I'm not going to go through all the details of the caveats of these studies, but study after study, when you look at high school completion, when you look at university entrance scores, when you look at IQ, and this is one of the biggest studies to be done in decades. It was done 2 years ago. And it found that those who smoked marijuana regularly for 3 years as a teen, by the time they were age 38, even controlling for other factors, they had an 8-point difference in IQ versus those who didn't smoke marijuana regularly when they were teens. And that's what the 3 diagnosis means. It means 3 to 4 times a week for 3 to 4 years. And that is significant. I mean, 8 points on the IQ scale, as you probably know, is enough to take you from average, being an average student, to being below average, to the other decile. That's a big difference when you look at IQ and when you look at what that means for your future. Again, I'm not saying, and I don't think any of the scientists are saying, that if you smoke marijuana, you're automatically going to get an 8-point reduction in IQ, or you're automatically going to drop out of school, or you're automatically going to destroy your life. The point is, the risk that those things happen go up. And so what, again, I don't think teens and really parents are understanding today is that this is risky. It's just a lot riskier than it was in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. And a lot of kids will get through it and be fine, and that is true. That's very true. But some won't, and we at least have to know the facts. It surprises people when I tell them, most of the time kids will try it, not really like it, actually try it a couple times and be done with it. But for those that don't, for those that this becomes a regular part of their life, this is what we're worried about in the medical world, certainly the learning and really the tuning out of life, and that is a huge part of the learning issues and the school aptitude. We also know that regular marijuana use corresponds with all kinds of social outcomes like unemployment. Doesn't mean that everyone who uses pot is going to be unemployed again. It just means the chances go up. Gaining a university degree, all kinds of things. When you look at and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but the suicide issue is such a huge issue. The record number of suicides in this country is unbelievable now among kids, and the record number of mental illness is incredible. When you start digging deep into the nexus of marijuana, more than any other drug that I've seen, and mental illness, things like suicide, depression, anxiety, especially among those who are genetically predisposed. You don't know if you're genetically predisposed. I mean, you may know an aunt that has psychosis or schizophrenia, hopefully not, or an uncle or whatever, so you might think that you have some genetic disposition, but you don't really know. If you do have a genetic disposition to these things, there can be a real problem if you're a regular user of marijuana, and that is being explored today, but not many people know about it. And I just like to point out for communities, as it is, the U.S. is ranked almost #1 in marijuana use in the world. I mean, Canada and a couple others are ahead of us, but we're pretty close to the top. And yet we have fallen behind greatly in educational achievement worldwide. And like I was talking to the kids today, who they're competing against for jobs is not who their older siblings or parents competed against for jobs. We're in a global economy, okay? This is not about, the next town over or, even those who live in the city versus those who live in the suburbs. We're talking about a global economy where jobs are becoming, frankly, and good jobs are becoming more and more scarce. And, if we care about that as a society, I don't see how we could be going down this path of legalization, which would increase acceptance. Like I said, the mental illness, we're going to leave all this with you, but the schizophrenia, the psychosis, all of these studies are showing very strong correlations. It doesn't show causation. That's almost impossible to show. But when you start looking at hundreds of people over time, and you look at mental illness, you look at regular pot use, we're seeing a very tight correlation that is at least a cause for concern. The car crashes, this is now moving over to sort of societal impacts versus individual impacts, but it's no surprise if you know people who smoke a lot of marijuana. They don't exactly have the quickest reflexes, right? That's sort of when you look at reflexes, reaction time, it doesn't take a genius to know that reaction time is not increased when you're high. Well, that translates to driving, and so we actually know that drivers who test positive for marijuana are about twice as likely than non-smokers to get into a car crash due to their marijuana use. But 30% of kids in this country, according to a recent poll, think that marijuana makes them a better driver. The other 30% says it has no effect on my driving, and a smaller percentage says it makes me a worse driver. And so we have a lot of education to do. This is a poll of almost 2,000 junior high and high school students by SAD and Liberty Mutual Insurance. And it's because, folks, they're getting the message, yes, from entertainers. We can blame the media, absolutely. But, really, social media. If you Google marijuana now, if any kid or puts it in YouTube, you're not going to get videos about the harms. You're going to get, 23,000 videos, and I'm not exaggerating, about how to make how to make the butane hash oil marijuana, right? You're going to get the videos of the people, of entertainers who, unbeknownst to most kids, are being paid by the marijuana industry to go on late night television, make a joke out of this, and talk about how it's great, and talk about what brands of marijuana are great these days. This is a marketing machine. And, we used to want to blame we'd say, well, we blame the Mexican cartels, and then we wanted to blame the Colombians, and then we're going to blame the Afghans for the heroin. We can't blame those people in this case, It's really, it's ourselves. We are promoting and commercializing a new industry right in front of our eyes. So I think that the gulf has never been greater between the scientific understanding of marijuana's harms and the public's misunderstanding of the actual effects of marijuana. Some people say, well, we need to do more research. We can't do the research because it's illegal. Well, that's not true. There's research. Most industrialized countries are doing research on marijuana. It's not just America. And there's been more research today than there ever has been before. It doesn't mean that we can't learn more. Absolutely we can. There's a lot we don't know. There's a lot of things we need to explore. But, folks, we knew about the connection between lung cancer and smoking. Do you know actually when we knew about that? Does anyone want to take a guess about the year that science confirmed the link between lung cancer and smoking cigarettes?
1950?
50s, that's the typical answer. That's an educated guess, but it's way off. Anyone else want to guess? Yeah, in the late 1910s. Now, we didn't get any wind of it until about the 60s, until the Surgeon General finally put out a report and said, well, actually smoking something with, 100 hydrocarbons and all the other things probably isn't the best thing for your lungs and probably is causing cancer. And you still had an industry up until 1999. That's not that long ago. I mean, it's really not that long ago, who were up at Congress lobbying and in front of the Congressional Committee, and we have it all on tape, thanks to C-SPAN, saying that they didn't think cigarettes were addictive. And attacking anyone as a zealot who said that they were. And so my thing is, we sort of were fooled before about this for a century, essentially. It took us that long to realize, we probably shouldn't smoke in a little metal bird 36,000 feet in the air that's encapsulated with no ventilation. Probably smoking's not a good idea in that case. It took us that long to say we probably shouldn't allow smoking in public spaces where there are kids around, especially in families. I just don't know how long it's going to take for us to kind of wake up to some of these health harms, but I do think it's important that we talk about them. That there are studies, and this is very true, that there are medicinal aspects of the marijuana plant. What do I mean by that? Well, because THC gets you high, well, that actually means it could be and is potentially very good for things like nausea and pain, because when you're high, you're not feeling the pain and you're not feeling the nausea. That's why morphine is the best painkiller we know about, because morphine is what? An opiate, right? Morphine is essentially, and things like Dilaudid, right, which you get in the hospital, are essentially, that's like medical grade heroin. I mean, that's exactly what it is. It comes from the poppy, the opium plant, and et cetera. So it makes sense that THC, which also gets you high, could be good for pain relief. And actually, studies show that it is. And the reality is, the answer to is marijuana medicine is complicated. You don't smoke any medicine, so it's not smokable form. There are marijuana-based pills that have shown to be effective, and many other things. There are, like, remember I said there are hundreds of ingredients in the pot plant? Some of those ingredients alone or together or whatever have shown to have some therapeutic value, absolutely. But the reality is the research is ongoing. And unfortunately, research takes a while. And, we all don't want to wait often, but it does. And it's important that the research does go forward. There are approved medications. This is one of them. This is not yet approved in the US, but it's being researched. This is called Sativex. It's a oral mouth spray, which does not get you high. When advocates are presented this like, well, no, wait, we don't want this. We just want to be able to grow, some pot, and that's medicine. It's like, well, no, this has a defined dosage. We know what's in it. It's the if you get your aspirin from New York and you get your aspirin from Hawaii, you know that it's the same dosage and it's the same aspirin. Can you imagine if you were in Hawaii, you had to ask somebody, well, where was the aspirin grown? What was the weather like? No, there's something called batch-to-batch consistency. By the way, do you all know where aspirin comes from now that I said aspirin? The bark of a willow tree. That's aspirin. That's the active ingredient in aspirin. It's the bark of a willow tree. Can you imagine if we said, forget the aspirin, grow a willow tree in your backyard, and, that's your dose of aspirin. Go ahead and chew the bark. No, we have aspirin because it has a dosage that we understand. So I have no problem with medicines based on marijuana. Let's just have defined dosage, defined regulation, and not this kind of, sort of free-for-all. Again, in New York, you're doing it a little bit better. We're doing it better here than other states, but I worry that it's a slippery slope. There are other medications for kids with epilepsy that I'm not going to get into. If you have questions about it, we'll talk about it. Oils that could be used. I'm going to go forward, though, on this. And there's a lot of research about it. I want to talk about another myth that's out there before we take questions. This myth is the one that, countless people are behind bars for smoking marijuana. Less than 0.5% of people in state prisons are there for marijuana possession. And most of those people, here in the red, that are even there at all for marijuana possession, were there for something far worse and pled down. The average pot user is not in prison. If that was the case, we'd have millions more people in prison, because millions more people have tried marijuana than are actually in prison and are using. So yes, I think incarceration is a difficult issue. Criminal justice reform is absolutely something we need to be talking about as a country. But to be focused on marijuana possession as a example of criminal justice reform is totally misguided, because that people are not in jail for pot. In fact, less than even 0.02% of people in federal prison are even there for any kind of drug possession. That was state. This is federal now. It's just not happening. And then the fourth myth, which is a big one, is that alcohol and tobacco are good examples of legalization. In other words, Kevin, beer and cigarettes are legal, so why isn't pot legal? And the reality is, folks, that can anybody say with a straight face that the legalization of alcohol or tobacco has been a positive for public health? Is there any, well, a little bit? Okay, yeah, we can talk about it.
Because
Yeah.
during Prohibition,
Sure.
people were drinking harder liquor,
Mhm.
and that they feel that
Yeah.
this actually, when they legalized it,
Yeah.
that there was less of an incidence of.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good answer, because there was a lot of bootleg liquor, but the difference is here between alcohol and marijuana is that alcohol is used by 70% of Americans, right? And that's why prohibiting it was futile, because you couldn't say to seven out of 10 Americans, you're criminals tomorrow, now, because we have prohibition. Less than 10% of Americans use marijuana. Even though more and more people use it, it's still a minority number of people who use it. I think it's very difficult to say, even with the fact that alcohol, like you said, fewer people are using things like wood alcohols and getting poisoned. When you look at every kind of violence in this country, every kind of social ill, we can point to alcohol, right, as one of the links and one of the reasons. I've never met any cop that has said, man, if only more people were drinking, we'd be safer. I've never met any teacher that has said, if only more kids drank, we'd have better classrooms. I've never met any coach say, if only more. So, yes, we don't want to necessarily go back to prohibition, and I think we don't, because alcohol has this history in our culture, frankly, for better or worse, that other drugs don't have. But I think we're learning a painful lesson with tobacco and alcohol, that when you legalize something, even if you sort of have to because of its cultural sort of resonance, the painful lesson is that when we legalize something, we normalize it and we commercialize it and we promote the heck out of it. And, we may be, not sure what happened there, we may be, producing toys and other things in other countries because it's expensive to produce them here. But when you want to talk about marketing and promotion, this is the country you're still, Madison Avenue is still where you market and promote. Even if you manufacture your toys in, a province in China because it's cheaper, you're still advertising here because we are the kings and queens of advertising. 10% of all drinkers in this country fund 75% of the revenues of the alcohol industry. What does that mean? It means that most of you don't drink a lot. Most people don't drink actually a ton. Most people do drink responsibly. The small number of people who don't, the 10%, fund 75%, like I said, of the revenues of the alcohol industry. That means that if, we hear these slogans, enjoy responsibly, on the bottom of a beer ad. If everybody enjoyed responsibly their alcohol, there would be no alcohol industry, period. Because these industries only thrive on people who, frankly, use irresponsibly. And my worry is, as we're trying, the country is going towards marijuana legalization, that we are inadvertently or on purpose encouraging very, very heavy use, because that's the only way you make money here. And really, folks, that is why we're even talking about this subject right now, because there's a small number of people who want to make a lot of money. And they see this as a way to do that. And some people think, well, we can get rid of the black market, right? If you legalize something, you don't have a black market. Well, first of all, cartels are diversified businesses. They're dealing in heroin, cocaine, human trafficking, sex slavery, fake Gucci bags, methamphetamine, all kinds of different things are how they make their money. They're not going to be going away if we legalize pot. And what many people don't know today is that a humongous black market exists for tobacco. Do you know that in New York State, 70% of the cigarettes are not legal cigarettes? It sounds shocking, the stat. What do I mean? I mean, not only they're not black market like you bought them from a dealer, but when you buy them from the bodega in Queens, 90% of those are brought up from South Carolina, where they're not taxed, more or less not taxed, in a U-Haul. and sold much cheaper than if that bodega in Queens bought it from a legitimate supplier. No, when you tax something, you have a black market for it. So people want to get rid of the black market for pot, it's going to be very, very difficult to do. We put this ad in the New York Times. You can't really see it from there, but it says perception and reality. The perception being the hippie, the reality being the Wall Street CEO. This isn't about hippies and the war movement anymore. And I do like to remind, as I reminded the kids today, of our history, of our wonderful history of restricting and regulating intoxicating, addictive substances. And I like to remind us of 100 years ago, we started with Dr. Batty's, right here, asthma cigarettes. This is medical tobacco, we called it. Does it sound familiar? Asthma cigarettes for your health. Then we kind of got mature about it, I guess, in the 1950s. We stopped saying medical tobacco. We simply said more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. We brought the celebrity endorsements. As your dentist, as your dentist, I would recommend Viceroy's. This is what comes with a country that covets its First Amendment for good reasons. But unfortunately, the flip side of the free speech that we all absolutely are thankful for, the flip side is the fact that we have this kind of stuff. And until we figure, and by the way, the only reason we don't even see that anymore is not because we've outlawed tobacco advertising. You know that. We can't outlaw them. The only reason you don't see Joe Camel anymore, the only reason you don't see these anymore, is because, again, after 100 years of lies and deceit, we made the tobacco industry essentially agree to a voluntary ban of their advertising, because you can't really restrict the advertising. But we made them do that, otherwise we were going to outlaw tobacco when we found out all the things they were doing. And by the way, tobacco and marijuana are colluding. Okay, people say, well, the tobacco industry would never get involved with marijuana. Well, wait a minute. You're talking about a leaf, they're both leaves, that you process, that you roll into something that you smoke. The idea that the tobacco industry is going to say, oh yeah, no, we're not going to get involved in that. There's already evidence as early as the 1970s that the tobacco industry was interested in the pot industry. There's evidence, these are all the confidential memos from the tobacco industry that they had to turn over to the US government after we found out that they were lying about the addictive nature. When you go through those memos, you see how they're targeting kids. You see how they're targeting, frankly, how they're targeting minority communities and the poor. This is very interesting. There was a tobacco executive who told Congress, oh, we don't smoke this expletive, we just sell it. We reserve that right for the young, the poor, the black, and the stupid. I mean, this is how they operated. There's the apple flavor cigarette. This was Brown and Williamson, that later became, I believe, part of Philip Morris, saying that this was a whole memo on how to market to youth and how to market to, especially to girls, to younger 14, 15-year-olds. And now we see, again, I see this being repeated for marijuana. I want to stop in a second to take your questions, but I'm going to do two quick things before we stop, if it's okay. One is, everyone thinks, well, I don't like pot, but you know what, if it solves our budgetary problems, then, count me in. And one thing I like to do is ask, you still have a lottery here, right? We have a lottery in this thing. I just moved, so I'm not sure. Yeah, we do, okay. So school funding is off the charts as a result, because that's what we were promised, right? Number one in the country for school. No, we're not, for education funding, because of the lottery. But we're promised these things. That was what the lottery was for. Do you think the lottery was for because we all wanted to play a game and get rich? No, the lottery was founded on the premise that we would fund education and other programs. Alcohol was legalized, by the way, re-legalized from alcohol prohibition. If you read the history of alcohol prohibition, why did the big industrialists like Carnegie and Rockefeller, why did they go along with alcohol prohibition being repealed? Because they were in favor of prohibition in the beginning, because it was hurting their factories to have drunk guys at their factory all the time. That's why they put the money in to pass the Prohibition Amendment. Why did they flip? If you read like a book like The Last Call by Daniel Okrent that the Ken Burns documentary on PBS was based on, you will read that the reason they agreed to it is because they were promised that if we legalize alcohol, we'll have no more need for a corporate income tax anymore, because of all the money we're going to get from legalized alcohol. It's not really working out that way either. I want to show you what the deficit of alcohol and tobacco is on our society. For every dollar, essentially for last year, we made $16 billion in revenues on alcohol. Sounds pretty good. It's a lot of money. It cost us $249 billion, the cost of alcohol in society. Tobacco is even worse because of the healthcare costs of tobacco. We got more revenues, $33 billion in taxes from tobacco because cigarettes are taxed are taxed pretty high, as you know. So we got 33. Cost us $314 billion. We're not making money from allowing addiction to go on in this country. Let me tell you, you can tax, all the heroin and OxyContin and everything else that you want. The problems that you get as a result of encouraging use are way, majorly outweighed by the problems. And even the New York Times, which has not been very friendly on this issue, they had an article recently that said marijuana taxes will not save state budgets. In Colorado, they thought they were going to make all this money. And they did make some money. But they didn't make the money that they thought they were to construct the schools and to do all the things. And instead, now the schools are saying marijuana is now the #1 problem for us. And they said, well, wait a minute. It's illegal if you're not 21. They said, yeah, so is alcohol. Alcohol's been our #1 problem forever. How are we doing on that, by the way? Just because it's legal, you have age 21. It's a major issue. So I'm not going to talk about the Netherlands or Portugal. If you have questions on that, we can talk about it. I do want to just leave you with a couple of slides on Colorado. This is what one of the, many of the Colorado pot stores look like. And your eyes, you may think your eyes are deceiving you. This is not a candy store, but that's what it looks like. I actually walked into one of these, and they said to me, "Are you medical or are you recreational?" They asked me. And I said, well, what an interesting question. It doesn't make a difference. I mean, they had just passed recreational pot. They were so happy. I was like, well, aren't we all recreational now, guys? I mean, come on, the veil is off. And they said, no. Well, you got to understand. If you're on the medical side, you don't have to pay the tax. If you're on the recreational side, you pay the tax. And I said, well, why wouldn't everybody be medical then? And they said, well, because you need to get well, not even a prescription, that's illegal because it's a legal drug. You need to get an assessment from a medical professional. I said, oh, okay, well, at least you do that. I said, no, don't get us wrong. If you have $200 cash, we'll have the person here in 10 minutes, and, you'll easily pass it, don't worry. You can. And I was like, do I look that unhealthy? I was like, no, you'll just, have you had problems sleeping in the last year, was one of the questions. Well, have you been anxious in the last year? Yeah, probably every day. I live in New York now, right? It's like what we, have you had a headache? Do you have that? I mean, it was incredible. And, but in all reality, these are the candies, the lollipops, the gummy bears that they're selling. These are actually the gummy bears. The numbers of kids and adults that have got to go to the emergency room in Colorado have just skyrocketed because of these edibles. Why? You think if you're going to eat a pot gummy bear or muffin or candy or cookie that it's better than smoking, right? Because you're like, oh, well, smoking's really bad for you. So maybe, how bad can a muffin be, right? The problem actually with that is one of the things that happens when you smoke something is that it goes directly to your brain, right? That's why if you smoke crack, for example, if you smoke cocaine, that's what crack is. The reason crack was so scary, really, was because it hit the brain so much faster than regular cocaine, because you smoked it. And so when you smoke marijuana, it hits the brain very fast. When you eat marijuana, it takes some time. So it maybe takes 20 or 30 minutes to metabolize. You're thinking, God, this muffin was nothing. I'll have another one, or I'll have a couple more gummy bears, or whatever. And so all of a sudden, you don't feel anything, and then in half an hour, it takes about half an hour for most people, it's this onslaught of essentially anxiety that most people feel, right? And that's why they're going to the ER because of mainly what clinicians would call psychotic episodes, really like a panic or anxiety attack. And it's happening because you're ingesting it, not feeling anything, you feel fine, you're doing other things, and then it hits you all at once. It's just the new policy, only 2 years old, but they're already finding the increase in school problems, the increase in dropouts, the increases in youth use, the increases in driving incidents. But unfortunately, you have a lobby there that is sugarcoating everything, that is saying nothing's wrong. It's like the classic, what problem? What problem? We're great over here. And in reality, we're seeing the problems mount. So I started an organization called SAM with Congressman Patrick Kennedy, Smart Approaches to Marijuana. We're not trying to say that we want to put people in prison for using pot. We're not trying to say, make a moral judgment. We're simply wanting to say we need to wake up as a country, understand that this is a real danger with this industry, understand that young people, when they're using, for example, these e-cigarettes, people think, well, e-cigarettes, they're so much better for you because you're not smoking. And instead you're inhaling water vapor, so how bad can it be? Well, if you're a chain smoker your whole life and then you move over to an e-cigarette, yes, that is better that you're using an e-cigarette versus it being a chain smoker smoking 2 packs a day. But if you're a young person, the idea that an e-cigarette is safe is totally false. You are still inhaling all of those things that you shouldn't be into your lungs. You still have the idea that these vaporizers that you really can't control the heat level. It's the heat that is problematic. You can't control the heat, and you often end up doing more of it than you would actually if you were smoking a cigarette. There's all of these new things like the e-cigarettes and the dabbing and the edibles that I don't think the average parent who grew up in the era of Woodstock was really exposed to. And unfortunately, that with the popular culture, with the media, with the legal changes driven by a money-hungry industry, this is producing a lot of confusion. And hopefully you've learned something tonight, but what is more is we really need to educate Americans more on the problems, given what we're seeing in the classroom, given what we're seeing on the roads, given what families with histories of mental illness are now seeing. I think this is something we really need to be alerted to.
You could explain exactly what this dabbing is with
Yes.
this wax, because I've never heard of it.
Yeah, and most people haven't. So again, what happens is you can you either buy it or you can try and make it yourself with PVC pipe and butane normally. And essentially what happens in this process, you extract this very oily, waxy substance from the marijuana. And that oily, waxy substance is pure THC. That's what that 98%, I was showing 98% THC, that's what that is. The thing about gateway is really interesting. It's very controversial. I don't really like the term gateway because it means a lot. It just doesn't, I feel like it doesn't have meaning. People think that if you say it's a gateway, it means that everyone who used marijuana is going to go to heroin or like it's some absolute thing. I talk about a pathway, actually. Absolutely, marijuana, among people who are using other drugs, marijuana 99 times out of 100 was part of the path to those other drugs. Now, why or what's the connection or what? There are a lot of theories. Is it because it was like a toe in the water where they tried marijuana and then they wanted to try something else because they already were doing something kind of illegal, so they might as well do another thing illegal? Was it because they ran into dealers who one day gave them pot and then the next day said, try this other thing, meth? Usually that's not the case, but that's a popular myth that's out there. Because most people, by the way, the market for marijuana is not the same people that are selling you heroin or meth. It's often very, very different. But another pathway that scientists are looking into is more of a biological pathway, right? Are you essentially priming your brain for a bigger high? And when one high is not enough, and your brain is like, I'm still really hungry for that feeling of euphoria, and I'm not getting it from the pot that you've been, giving me every day for 10 years. I'm kind of over that. I need something else. That's a potential, what I would call reason for the pathway. But the bottom line is most people who try marijuana won't go on to other drugs, but most 99% of the people who are using other drugs, marijuana was part of that journey to get there. So again, it kind of depends how you look at it. Absolutely, for some people, this has been a major pathway and reason why they're using it. If you ask them why, they will say that. So this idea of an overdose. First, I think it's important to define what an overdose is. Most people think overdose means you die, right? Like you had an overdose on heroin, and that it means that you're dead. A lot of people overdose on heroin, and thankfully don't die. With marijuana, absolutely there are overdoses, and they're happening in Colorado at a faster rate than any other state, surprise, surprise. And what that means is basically someone has taken so much, or the dabbing or whatever, the edible, that their body totally can't handle it, and they have to go to usually the emergency room as a result. Dying from an overdose of marijuana doesn't usually happen. Why? Because this is very interesting. I showed you that brain slide earlier. unlike a drug like heroin, there are no receptors in the brain stem which control breathing and heart rate for marijuana. That's a good thing. That means that, unlike heroin, which absolutely can stop your heart and stop breathing, that the THC is not going to stop breathing. Now, it may rapidly increase your heart rate. There are some reports of direct THC leading to death, overdose. We're still looking into that. But absolutely, you can overdose on marijuana. It happens all the time, thousands of times a year, thousands of people a year. Dying from that overdose is less likely, but that's no reason to say, a lot of kids tell me, well, Kevin, no one's died from pot. You hear that a lot, right? No one's died from marijuana. Well, a couple thousand people a year have died on the road from people who are high on marijuana. That, to me, and people die, the suicide issue with marijuana is huge, and also accidents. Like literally the kid who was in Colorado and had an edible and jumped off a building because he thought his friends and the light bulbs were attacking him. Well, that's because of the marijuana edible. So if that's not dying from marijuana, tobacco, by the way, doesn't produce an overdose like that either, right? Can't die from your heart stopping because you're smoking cigarettes in that moment. But we would never say tobacco doesn't cause death. Of course it does. It doesn't cause the direct death because lung cancer kills you, emphysema kills you. But you got that from tobacco. It's the same thing with marijuana. The driving impaired will kill you. The hallucination may kill you, like it's killed several people in Colorado. Even if it's not the marijuana that is causing you to stop breathing or your heart stop. Does that make sense? Yeah. Synthetic marijuana, the only thing it has in common with marijuana is the name. It's very different, and the bath salt. Have you heard of bath salts and this? But yeah, it's all obviously bath salts has nothing to do with a bathtub. It's just the name of it. Basically, what happened with marijuana was when they were doing research on marijuana, you can chemically alter the composition of marijuana so that it becomes essentially a lab-made drug, very different than marijuana that you smoke, which is grown on as a plant. These are laboratory-made chemical substances. And therefore, they have rapidly different effects. So you have a very extreme, violent tendencies, suicidal tendencies. Hallucinogenic, obviously marijuana is also hallucinogenic, but it's just a very different degree of result from synthetic marijuana or these bath salts. The bath salts are other kinds of synthetic drugs, not based on the marijuana chemical structure, but on other chemical structures that are altered, that then turn up as bath salts or plant food or whatever, multiple things. And the reason they're scary and so deadly is because they keep law enforcement off guard, because it's like, oh, well, JW63-4 is illegal, but JW63-47215 is different and therefore not illegal. So it's really difficult because these things are very dangerous. There is this notion that because it's illegal, you can't research it, and the FDA can't research it. That's wrong. The FDA is researching it. Should they research it more? Absolutely. It is harder than if it was just aspirin, because aspirin's legal and marijuana is illegal. That absolutely, it's by definition, it's a little bit harder to research, but it is being researched. It should be. But yeah, regulating it, no, they can't because it's illegal. There is an issue of the lacing with other drugs. That is happening. It's 85%, but it is happening. It's also happening in Colorado. The idea that that's my whole point. The idea that you can regulate that and that's not happening elsewhere is a misnomer. Because in Colorado, you not only have the legal black market, you have the gray market, right? What does that mean? It means the older brother who's 21 bought the legal one and is selling it to the younger brother who's 16. That's the gray market. And then you have the legal market. So you have three markets as opposed to just the black market. And you're seeing contaminants and molds and pesticides and all kinds of things in supposedly regulated marijuana in Colorado. They just closed and recalled a bunch of marijuana products there, and they've only tip of the iceberg. God knows how much. That was only because they tested a certain amount, but they can't test everything. And there are multiple products that have, whether they're laced or have other issues with them in Colorado, right? Even though it's supposed to be regulated. I think it's this whole regulation issue is a myth. It sounds great. To the average person, it's like, let's regulate and control and tax drugs like marijuana so that we can control what's in them, we can make some money for our schools, and we can get rid of the cartels. It sounds great, but that's not happening. The reality is in industry, the reality is promotion, the reality is kids thinking it's okay, And the reality is you now have multiple markets to worry about, not just the black market. Yeah.
How does synthetic marijuana look and smell differently from
Okay.
non-synthetic?
It is different. It does not smell like marijuana. It's often like the spice and K2. No, sometimes it can look like it because it looks like a herb. It's an herbal substance. That's true. But the smell is going to be different because it's a totally different chemical compound. It's very, very, very different.
So what does it smell like?
It just depends on the brand. Usually there's not necessarily a smell. It's like a burning, but it's not necessarily a distinct smell. I wish I could say that there's a way that parents could identify it. But the scary thing about the e-cigarettes is absolutely what you said. Because it's odorless, you don't know if they're using tobacco, marijuana, what they're using. And worse, it's not only odorless, they're using it in, if I had my flash drive, I would bring it, but they're using it in contraptions that look like things like flash drives, pens, highlighters. You would, if you're an 8th grade teacher, you would have no idea. You know, it used to be like you could smell the pot from the boys' bathroom. That's gone. All right, it's a guy, it's like sometimes a good student, right, using a highlighter.
Is this called a blunt?
That's different. I'll talk about what a blunt is if you'd like in a minute. Absolutely. No, a blunt is different. But no, the e-cigarettes are electronic. They often plug into the side of your computer. They look like a pen or a highlighter. You can't smell it at all. And that's a real issue because, you know, and the kids will say, well, no, this is tobacco. Don't worry.
The kids can buy them on the internet.
You can, oh yeah, you can buy them online.
They can look like an inhaler, like an albuterol inhaler.
A blunt could be one of a couple things. A blunt is smoked. It's usually a big joint, but it's often mixed with tobacco, right? So I guess maybe that's what you're getting at. But it's not a electronic device. It's basically a joint that you can mix with tobacco. No, we've done such a good job with smoking, anti-smoking campaigns. I mean, when I ask kids how many people think tobacco is harmful, everyone raises their hand, which is great. When I ask them about marijuana, it's about 20% raise their hand. And then they think the problem with smoking, with cigarettes, is simply the fact that you're smoking. As long as you then use an e-cigarette, they think, well, then it's okay. Well, the reality is it's not. But that's unfortunately been a byproduct of our successful anti-smoking campaign, has been, well, that means that pot's okay and e-cigarettes are okay, even if smoking a cigarette is not okay anymore. I mean, so secondhand marijuana smoke is a very big deal, and we're only beginning to learn about it. They're doing some studies about how it affects like your blood vessels and other things, and they're finding it has very similar effects as tobacco. Surprise, surprise. What they're finding in Colorado too is a lot of people who voted for legalization thinking they could regulate it, they didn't realize that meant that you could smoke on your patio, and if you're in a condo complex or wherever you're walking down the street with your kids, that all of a sudden they're now exposed to secondhand, thirdhand smoke through thirdhand through other ways, like through vents and stuff like that. And so, yeah, absolutely, that's a big concern. And again, marijuana is different. It has a psychoactive component to it that's intoxicating more than just, the tobacco smoke. So it's a very big concern, actually. So I hope I didn't depress all of you, but there are things you can do. I mean, there are things that it's important that you stand up and talk about this. Our website is learnaboutsam.org, which I can put up here, but learnaboutsam.org has every kind of resource, infographic, video, anything you need if you want more educational materials, more scientific materials. We do talks all around the country. We are supported by a scientific advisory board of the top physicians around the country, top public health people around the country on this. And we really do need your help. The main studies from Health and Human Services that was just released finding that Colorado, for the first time ever, is now the #1 state in the country for 12 to 17-year-old marijuana use. And this is in a state where they said, well, we'll be able to regulate it. Marijuana use among kids will go down, Kevin, because we're going to regulate it, and we're going to get it out of the hands. It's a great line. If you don't know the issue, it's like they say, we're going to get it out of the hands of drug dealers, Kevin. Drug dealers don't ID. We're going to get it into the hands of legal business people. Sounds great, right? It's not working. So there are fact sheets on our website. There's an entire fact sheet on Colorado and Washington with all the latest data. We invite you to use that as well. Remember, we reduce tobacco use in this country. Yes, we demonize tobacco use, but we also, frankly, demonize the industry. And we told kids that they were being taken for a ride by a massive industry that was creating Joe Camel and candy cigarettes and all kinds of things that were essentially there to trick them. When I talk to kids, that's what I lead with. I lead with, listen, I mean, you don't have to believe me. Because let me tell you, they will go on Google and find every single counter study to everything I said. And by the way, a lot of people don't like me and will say all kinds of things. They'll find that very easily. And so that, I tell them, you got to do the research yourself. Obviously, you should listen to the American Medical Association, which does agree with me, before you listen to the American, Marijuana Association, which obviously doesn't agree with me, or the National Cannabis Industry Association, which is a real thing, that doesn't agree with me. It's going to be more biased than the American Academy of Pediatrics. So I asked them to look for the unbiased science for themselves, but also to look at how that there is this industry out there and how it's targeting them. And that seems to get through to a lot of kids. I'm here to tell you that there is a massive industry that sees you as the future of their profit margins. And you should know that, at least, because your entertainers and people you look up to, you don't know, are being sponsored by this very industry to make sure that you think it's okay to use. And I had a lot of kids afterwards come up and tell me that that resonated with them. And CASA is a great resource for parents, for young people, and a lot of opportunities to get involved in the community, so thank you. Thanks so much for coming tonight, spending your weeknight with me. I really appreciate it. I hope you learned something.
In closing, we hope today's program has provided you with important information regarding the dangers and consequences of marijuana use. With close to 25% of 11th and 12th grade students in Nassau County reporting past 30-day use of marijuana, we urge parents and caregivers to communicate early with their children about the dangers of substance abuse. Studies continue to show that parents and caregivers play a major role and positive role in their children's choices about alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. Thank you again for tuning in to today's program. Until next time, this is Kathy Samuels with Manhasset CASA, wishing you and your family a healthy and safe tomorrow. Thank you.